something's happening, but it's a little bit difficult to, explain what is really going on. By the way, this is the music. I mean, the music is by Curtis Rose. So he was he's the author of the book Computer Music Tutorial, and he was my advisor when I was at UCSB. And I did this visual. I made this visual for his piece, and the title of the piece is Sonal Atoms. And what's happening here is actually very simple. It's a little bit scientific. So we have two strings here, right? Left and right. And as you may guess, this is the sound from the left channel. And this is the sound represented visually from the right channel. And the vertical axis, or this direction, corresponds to frequency. So if we have more energy on the higher frequency part of the sound, you will have more activities in this area of the screen, right? So it is very simple and straightforward mapping from the sound to image. And that is what I want to discuss and explain a little bit further from now on. And I would like to approach the problem from the viewpoint of audiovisual art. And many people think of audiovisual art, and they also remember the name Kandinsky, right? So he was interested in both music and visual art. But Kandinsky was not the only person, and not the first one by any chance. In fact, this kind of making association between sound and image, or between audio and visual domains, dates back to 18th century. So this was an idea proposed by a Frenchman named Castel. And as we can see, we have a keyboard instrument here. And this guy plays the keyboard instrument. And as he plays the keyboard, the colors of each key is presented like this. And this is the diagram of the mapping from the musical note to color. And this is actually a real instrument which does the pitch to color mapping, right? So we have keyboard instrument here, and we have a number of windows over there. And if you press a key, the corresponding color will be displayed through one of these windows, right? So the thing is, Castel was not the only one, and believe it or not, many people try to have this kind of color to pitch mapping. So my point here is, this is quite old study. This is not something new, not recently developed. It has quite a long history, more than 200 or 300 years, right? So we can start from Sir Isaac Newton, 1704, and it comes to 2004, and still these days many people are trying to do this kind of color to pitch mapping, or people are trying to do something to kind of associate or relate the audio domain and visual domain. And that is what I want to explore a little bit here. And if you want to get more information or get more references, I strongly suggest that you check this reference. That is the master's thesis by Professor Golan Levin at Carnegie Mellon University. And from now on, let me start to play a couple examples of audiovisual art. And let me start by playing some video excerpts of something called abstract films. So I'm pretty sure many of you are aware of this. And abstract films are from the early 20th century, when people started to kind of visualize music using the cinema technology. So one example would be something like this. So music sounds very old, and as you can see, the visual also look old. And this is from 1925, so it is almost 100 years old. And another example would be the one on the right. So this one is more based on the actual image or actual film, while this one is, more abstract, right? So anyway, the point here is people try to use new technologies to kind of, implement this kind of audiovisual art, and perhaps a little bit less abstract one would be something like this. I'm pretty sure many of you are familiar with this example, Fantasia, and this is from Disney, and they try to, again, kind of visualize very famous classic tunes, Western classical music, and it may look easy, but if you think about the effort put into this video, it is just amazing. They had to analyze the music and then create the visuals or the animation totally based on the progression of the music. And another example would be something called soundtrack. So we all know what soundtrack is, especially OST, original soundtrack, and that is the sound or music included in movies, right? And the term soundtrack came actually from the structure of old cinema films, right? So we have this video track, and alongside the video track we have a very short, narrow track here, which is dedicated to record sound, right? So this is called soundtrack, and usually when you record a movie, the sound is recorded as some visual pattern, right? Like this one or this one. So this is kind of like a waveform. But some people try to put images in this track. So they did not record a sound. Instead, they try to draw pictures and then put that pictures into this area of the film to create sound and visual track at the same time. And one of the famous examples would be this one, Synchromy, created by Norman McLaren. And in this case, it is not like visualizing pre-existing music. It is more like creating the visuals and the sound at the same time from one image. And the mapping is quite straightforward, as you can guess. If we have, if the vertical space is narrower, the pitch gets higher. And if the width of this pattern becomes wider, the volume gets increased, right? So volume and pitch, that is quite straightforward. It sounds very boring maybe, but if we proceed a bit further, it gets quite complicated, like this. So again, another example of audiovisual art. So there could be many ways. You can start from music and create visuals, or you can just draw some patterns and then create both visuals and music or sound from the same information. And of course, speaking of visualizing music, I think the ultimate example of music visualization would be the music score, right? So, it is the best way to present music visually, right? And there are many crazy ideas about visualizing music, and one of them I think is this one, the circular score. It may look quite radical and strange, and it doesn't make sense, but it actually makes quite a lot of sense, because if you think about a music that loops, if we have a music that is repeated forever, I think this kind of circular pattern is one of the best ways to represent that kind of, looping or repetition. Right? And another big aspect of musical score is the visual score. So this is an example of music by Ligeti, and as you can see, the content of the music is visualized like this. One thing we can notice here is the representation of time. So time goes from left to right, horizontally, right? While the vertical axis represents the pitch or maybe frequency. So the higher sound is represented in the upper part of the screen, and vice versa. And some people actually try more radical things, Mark Applebaum. So, I mean, this may look small, but this is actually a very big picture. So, Mark Applebaum, a Stanford professor, drew this big picture. It is quite big, and hung it on the gallery and invited performers to play music based on their own reception or their own, analysis or understanding of the score. So this serves as a visual art project, and at the same time, a music score. And another example that I think is very interesting is this one, and let me see if we can get it up. Oh, okay. So this is something called Whitney music box, and in this example, let me play. It's quite straightforward. We have a lot of dots rotating, right, in a circular pattern, and each dot goes across the horizontal line here and makes some sound. And what's happening here is, it isn't like visualizing a sound or creating a sound from any visuals. In this case, you start from an algorithm or a mathematical formula to control or govern the motions of these dots, right? And that mathematical formula determines the music and the visuals at the same time. So in this case, we started from some math, and then we have this interesting result. Just in case if you suffer from insomnia or anything like that, I'm not sure, I mean, what is insomnia in Japanese? Yeah, if you have any problem sleeping, try this and you will fall asleep in 2 or 3 minutes, I promise. And or if you don't like this, if you think this is too boring, we actually have some more interactive stuff, so you can, do it by yourself with some interesting user interface. Okay. And let me go back to the slides. Okay, so those are some famous examples of maybe audiovisual art or visualizing sound or creating something that involves both visuals and sound, right? So here the question is there any universal language? Is there any perfect rule or, method to create a result with which everyone can agree? And that is actually quite tough. And many people would say no, because for the same sound or for the same music, we may think of different visuals, right? So this kind of association between audio and visual domain can vary from person to person. There is no one perfect rule. But having said that, there is still something, and let me ask this. I'm pretty sure some of you are already familiar with this example. So we have these two shapes, and let's say the names of these two shapes are Buba and Kiki. So you know what I'm talking about. So which one is Buba? This one? Or this one? Maybe this one, right? And this is Kiki. And my question is, how do we know? I mean, it's quite hard to explain or analyze why we have that kind of association, but there is definitely something, right? So this is Buba and this is Kiki. I think more than 90-something% of people would agree with that kind of association. So it is very difficult to set up a perfect rule for audiovisual art, but still there is something. There is some, unknown territory for us to explore, and that is where this term synesthesia comes in. And if I have to explain the concept of synesthesia, this is kind of the situation where one sensation or one sense, like something we hear, actually evokes another sense, like something we see. So if you can start from one type of information, like music, to get another different type of information, like visuals or animation or image, that can fall into this category of study, synesthesia. And so what I want to explore could be defined as synthetic synesthesia, because I want to create a visual or visuals from the sound. Right? And that is not natural, that is synthetic, that is what I artificially create. But what I hope is the result would convince many people so that they can agree that, okay, this music looks like this, or this visual resembles the music, or this visual gives me the idea of the music or the sound or something like that. So let's go back to the very basic part of this sound visualization. Perhaps the most famous examples of visualizing sound would be this one, waveform. So we all know what this is. So time goes from left to right, and the vertical axis represents the amplitude, or maybe the loudness. It is actually different. I mean, loudness is not exactly the same as the amplitude. Amplitude is the physical quantity, and loudness is more perceptual stuff, right? But anyway, we can think of this mapping first. And also another example would be spectrum, right? Spectrum means the distribution of energy over different frequencies, right? So in this case, we have this pattern, and we can instantly recognize that here we have a concentration of energy in this frequency band, right? And another concentration of energy in this frequency band. So in this case, horizontal axis means frequency or pitch, and the vertical axis is energy, or maybe something like amplitude or magnitude. Right? And this is the case of a spectrogram. Here, the horizontal axis is time, and the vertical axis represents frequency of the sound. Right? So I think those are the three most famous examples of visualizing music or representing sound in the visual domain. And in case of this, I think it is actually the same in terms of geometric framework. This is just like the musical score. I mean, time goes from left to right, and this axis corresponds to pitch. So we naturally get the idea of this visualization without much problem. Okay, and then let me try to introduce a couple more examples or things to consider for visualizing sound. Okay. So I would say visualizing sound or music is basically the process of parameter mapping. By parameter mapping, I mean we have these kind of parameters or elements of sound or music. So pitch, loudness, and timbre or sound color, these are considered as the three fundamental elements of sound, right? And other things like tempo, rhythm, or form, or musical texture, these are more, I mean, these are at higher levels, and these are more about music. Right? So at many different levels, we can get important features from sound or music. And on the other side here, in the visual domain, we have these kind of basic elements, shape, size, color of a visual object. And the object can move, or the object can be located at a different part of the screen, right? And based on how we organize the visual object on screen, we can get different compositions. Right? So I would say sound visualization is to define a set of mappings between these two domains, or from the audio domains to visual domains, like this. And another important feature in this mapping is time, because we are going from sound or music to visuals. And the thing is, sound is based on time, and time is one-dimensional, right? It goes over one straight line. But screens are two-dimensional. So almost everything we see are two-dimensional. So we have to define how we represent the sound, which changes over time visually. One way to do that, as we have seen before, is to map time horizontally. So you can start from left part of the screen to the right part of the screen to cover the whole screen over the duration of the sound or maybe music, right? And we can map something else to the vertical axis. And we can also put time to be mapped onto this vertical axis and then do something else with this horizontal axis. In these two cases, we are kind of recording the history of the sound or music over time, right? So they stay there, they stay on the screen, and they do not disappear. However, you can also make a video or animation that just flashes over time, that just goes away over time. So in this case, time is accumulated, time is recorded over time. That sounds very stupid. Time is recorded over time. Sorry, sound is recorded over time. But in other cases, the recording of sound is volatile. It just goes away. There's no memory of time. So that is another important feature when you want to design possible candidates for audiovisual mappings. And let me play some examples and play this once again, and let's see what is happening here. Again, the left channel and the right channel, and this vertical axis represents frequency. And if you have that information, you may understand the mapping more easily, I think. And another interesting aspect of this mapping is the shape of this axis. So it is usually straight, but sometimes it kind of it becomes spiral, right? So that kind of motion depends on the overall energy level, or maybe the volume or loudness of the sound. And here the color mapping is quite simple and very straightforward. So the left channel is represented as blue, and the right channel is represented as red. Okay, and another example is this one. So, by the way, this was in 2002, so the year we first met, and any guess in which language or which tool I used to create this? At that time, there was no processing. There was Max MSP, but it wasn't that advanced. Believe it or not, I did this using MATLAB. Yeah. So, I mean, true story, it was in the year of 2002, and it took me about 8 to 9 hours to render the video for 5 or 6 minutes of music. So, I mean, this is not a story from 1960s, this is from 2002, and I didn't have that, great computer, it was horrible, so. But anyway, now, it's just a snap. I mean, you can write less than 100 lines of processing code and it works instantly. So, okay. Sorry. And another example is this one. Notice the year of the piece. So about 13 or 14 years later, we have this, and oh, sorry. Once more. So you can naturally see that in this case the horizontal axis represents frequency. So the lower energy part in terms of pitch or frequency is represented on this part of the screen. And if we get any higher frequency component of the sound, it will be represented on the right side. So frequency, and what about the vertical axis? Any guess? No, actually there's nothing. It is just random. And that is another topic I want to discuss. Okay, by the way, the music is not composed by myself. I'm working with a composer, Professor Jiwon Yoon, who writes the music, and I'm just doing the visualization part. Okay. All right. So that is another example. And there are some other things to consider for visualizing sound. And the first one is psychoacoustics, or the way we perceive sound or music. I mean, you all know what the difference between the amplitude scale, 0 to 1, and the decibel scale, right? So even the small changes in this lower amplitude range is actually perceived very big by humans, right? So there is some things to consider when we really want to visualize sound in the way we perceive music. Just translating the numbers from the amplitude or things like that is not enough. You have to consider the characteristics of this perception, human auditory perception. And this is another interesting thing. I mean, I'm pretty sure most of you are aware of this Fletcher-Manson curve or equal loudness contour. So what this means is based on the frequency range or the bandwidth of the sound, our amplitude perception could be different. So what this curve suggests is that for the lower sounds, you might want to a little bit exaggerate the sound visually, because you might want to lower down the effect of the lower frequency part, and you might want to exaggerate the effect of this higher frequency part. Because we are more sensitive in this area, we actually perceive a lot more than what is physically in the sound in this area. For this area, however, we do not perceive everything in the sound. And if you just translate the sound directly to visuals without any compensation or consideration of this phenomena, your result would not perfectly match the way you perceive the music. So psychoacoustics is, I think, one of the most important parts in the area of sound visualization. And another thing is this one, musical structure. I mean, music is usually structured. It has some phrases and it changes over time. So your visual is also supposed to adapt and change over time based on the change of your music. So this is another example. Again, music is composed by Professor Yoon, and the piece starts this way. And the music is based on the typewriter sound. Actually, not the typewriter, but some old computer keyboard sound, or maybe mechanical keyboard. We have this keyboard typing sound, and the music progresses over time. And as we enter the next phrase, I think it should change somewhere here. Okay. So now you see we have more lines based on how music changes. And let me just go over the duration of the music and see how the visuals change. So, I mean, it is quite straightforward, right? So based on the progression of your music, your visual would change accordingly. So that is quite simple, but still important, I think. And another one is continuous motion. So this example, increase the volume a little bit. So this piece is based on the human voice. And we can see that the visual is responding to the loudness or volume of the sound, right? But what about the horizontal motion? Does it mean anything? The answer is no. I mean, these horizontal motions are just there. It isn't related to music at all. So my point here is, what you present visually on screen does not have to come from the music. I mean, you can start from your own visual ideas, and then you may get certain features from music, but there is no rule or no limitations for you to present everything visually only from the music. So you can, my approach is you draw your own picture, and part of your picture could be based on music, but don't get too much limited on your visual representation. Right? Let me go over to the next part. And here the topic is randomness. This is, in a sense, similar to what I have just discussed. And as we can see, we have number of dots moving on screen, and they somehow respond to the sound, right? So the motions are definitely related to the change of the music of the sound. But the path or the contours of these dots are not related to music at all. Actually, these dots, the motions of these dots are generated by some mathematical functions like Perlin noise. So it isn't coming from music. It is almost random. Only certain features of this figure, like the speed or maybe the size of the dots, are controlled or translated from the sound or music, but not everything. So, and another one, this, let me name this as exaggeration maybe. Is it playing? Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. So, now, if you look at the screen, I mean, there are numerous dots here, but actually these are not from the real sound. I just made up these, numerous small dots to give the impression that there is something in the sound. So there's nothing in the sound actually, but I intentionally put these small dots, and that gives us the impression that we have these small components from the sound. So this is an example of exaggerating the content of the sound. So I'm still making up a lot of new things that are not from the sound. So let me just summarize that. You might want to show much more than what you can get from the sound, and that is one interesting approach I would recommend. And just in case you might want to get more information on what I have done so far, I have a Vimeo page where you can see the examples of my audiovisual works. Okay, so I do not have that much time, but let me just go over maybe 3 to 4 more issues. Another interesting thing, or maybe not that interesting, but at least interesting to me, is that my role as a visual artist. So my point here is, okay, before we go further, let me do a quick visualization of a music. So let me start. Okay. Now we have a music, and this is what I actually did. I did it as a live performance. And what I did was to change the visuals, the properties of this visualization in real time. Just like this. And so there's no pre-scheduled, timetable. I just did this on site while listening to the music. So in this case, I was more like a performer. So I was a visual artist, of course, and I was a programmer. But at the same time, I was a performer. So that's another interesting aspect of this visualization, I think. And something people do not pay that much attention. So based on the progression of music, I changed my visuals in a number of different ways, so that it could be something like this or like this. I mean, again, my point here is, it isn't that clear, but again, I think I'm a programmer, and sometimes I'm a visual artist, but at the same time, one of the most important features of sound visualization, I think, is performance. You can make your visualizations real time. Sometimes I visualize music in real time, even those pieces I hear for the first time on site. So, it's actually quite challenging to visualize music that you have never heard before, but it is interesting in its own context. And in those cases, I think myself as a painter, maybe an impressionist painter, who listens to music and tries to get the image from the music based on my own interpretation, and then visualize my interpretation of music in my own way. So it is not scientific, it is no signal processing, it is just how I feel the music and how I represent it visually. So that is another interesting aspect of music. And speaking of collaboration with the composers or the musicians, these are some important and interesting aspects I'd like to discuss. So the first one is, for the composers, I asked the composer, Professor Yoon, whom I have been working with for more than almost a decade, and she told me that it is totally different for her to compose pieces that are intended to be visualized from the very beginning. So that is another interesting part for composers. So if you're a composer and you want to get your music visualized, then it may give you some interesting aspect for your musical composition. And for visual artists, the same story. You may create visuals after listening to the music, or you may create visuals while listening to the music for the first time, in real time, of course. So these kind of things are, they may sound trivial, but it will give you some new insight in terms of collaboration between visual artist and the composer. And some other small things. We have been talking about visualizing sound, which is, analytically a data mapping from one-dimensional information to two-dimensional information, right? So my point here is we may go into the opposite direction from two-dimensional space to one-dimensional space. And one example is this one. This is quite an old example that I did about a decade ago at a tech university. And as you can see, you can draw a path by pointing some locations on this interactive map. And based on the path you choose, you can create music, right? So the first thing, the motivation for this is I wanted to show that musical scores or musical visual representation of music could be, based on various geometric frames. So if you think of a musical score, it goes from left to right, top to bottom, right? But we can actually design a musical score on a two-dimensional space with some free drawing kind of stuff. That is the idea of this. And my point here is, when you work on sound visualization or music visualization, those experiences will give you some insight in terms of going into the opposite direction, creating music from a two-dimensional data space or plane interface or screen or things like that. And another one is visualizing not just the music but the performance. So let me play a video in which I was involved. So we have here a performer or a person who is on stage, and he has his smartphone and rotating his arm like this, and you can see that the direction he's aiming at is visualized on screen behind. Right? So, and this is just boring, nothing happens. until we have one more performer on screen who is supposed to come out and this was me, by the way, a little bit younger than now. And now what happens here is, if the first performer aims at the second performer, we can hear a sound, right? And vice versa. So, in this performance, sounds are made not individually by each performer, but made through collaborations or interactions between the performers on screen. And in this case, we wanted to challenge the concept that traditionally musical performance is individual and based on the individual performance by each player. Here, it is more like collaboration or interaction or making connections between people, right? And my point here is about visualization. So, can you think of this as a visualization of music? Maybe no, but combined with this performance and the performance on stage, I think this visualization gives enough information on how this music is performed or how this music progresses. So this is a visualization of performance, but at the same time it could serve as the visuals of this music. And the last example, last topic I'd like to mention is my latest interest, and that is space. So far I have shown examples of visualizations of music that are represented only on one screen, but the last exhibition I had was something like this. I was fortunate enough to rent a large hall in which I was able to set up 6 screens and 6 speakers, so it was kind of surround. I had 6 different sounds coming out, and at the same time I could represent those sounds on 6 different screens. So that actually gave us another dimension for expression, which is space, and that is currently I'm really interested in, and I'm trying to pursue a little bit further. So yes, that is kind of the collection of stupid things I have done so far, and even more stupid ideas I have. And I'm not sure whether this was useful. I mean, compared to the previous presentations, this is way less practical and less scientific or less theoretical or whatever. So, yeah. So sorry about that. But again, time to conclude my talk. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. 会場から1件ぐらい何か質問とか。
So maybe it depends by each. I'm Takuya Imabori. Hello. So I am also a composer. So actually, what is your kind of work? For example, a piece which fixed everything in art video, or other one is how to say, the real-time program. It can be sounded differently according to another sound, like spectral analysis or something. But in this case, maybe it sounds completely different for each time, according to music, like classical music or hip hop or something. Even classic Beethoven and Chopin and Stravinsky are completely different. So, what do you think about from where to until where it's your domain of your work?
I'm not sure whether I'm not sure whether I have understood every part of your question correctly, but okay, maybe the first thing, speaking of maybe the genre or the type of the music, I mean, it definitely has some effect on visualization. Perhaps maybe this example, the very first one I played, this one. So my advisor and I tried to use this visualization for different types of music. So we tried this with the electroacoustic music. At the same time, we tried this for some pop music or jazz or rock. We tried Steely Dan, we tried the Eagles, and so on and so forth. And they felt totally different. So I think there's definitely some different sweet spots for every different genre of music. And that is another interesting thing to explore. But maybe to simplify that kind of difference or maybe categorization, I think we can start from basic elements of the music. So is the music dependent on beat or rhythm, or is it less dependent on beat or rhythm? And that, I think, gives you the first point of choice. So depending on your choice from that point, you can go into 2 or 3 different directions. So it might be very interesting to kind of approach that problem. I mean, choosing the optimal visual framework or visualization strategy based on genre in a more systematical way. I haven't really thought about that problem, systematically or maybe theoretically, but based on my experience and practice, yes, there are big differences, and that is very interesting topic to explore. Yes. And I'm not sure if did I understand? Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. じゃあウニーさんに以上お願いします。これで、研究会は終わりですけれども、4時からコンサートがあります。向こうのこの同じフロアの入り口に近い方のホールで4時から日韓、ACMP のコンサートがありますので、ぜひそこにもおいでください。で、インスタレーションが、時間があんまりなくなっちゃったんですけども、1階の入り口入って左手のところのギャラリーでインスタレーションをやっていますので、ぜひそこにも、おいでください。これから説明が入ると思いますが、そういう感じですね。で、その後夜に、6時でコンサート終わるんですけども、花火大会があるのですぐに離れてくださいと、北千住を離れてくださいとの、案内がありました。ローカルからありました。それで、19時15分から上野で、懇親会を予定しております。韓国の方々佐藤さん、ここでよかったですね。
あ、そうです。
はい、上野のレンコン料理のお店で、なんか古材を使った素晴らしい日本の古材を使った素晴らしい店構えの、お店だそうで、ここが19時15分から、懇親会がありますので、ぜひ参加される方は、そこの受付で、懇親会のところに丸をつけてください。で、一応コンサート終わった後に皆さんで移動することにはなっております。で、先に移動したいって方は、ここのお店、上野レンコンというお店ですというのをお伝えしております。はい、それでは今日はどうもありがとうございました。これで39回研究会を終わりたいと思います。